Welcome to the Psychosocial Shift podcast, where we explore a national conversation around workplace health and safety, psychosocial risk, family domestic violence, harassment in our communities, both now and in generations to come. Each week, we meet with top leaders in this field around the nation to have meaningful conversations and to help organisations to make meaningful progress on this issue. Well, hi everyone, welcome to the Psychosocial Shift podcast. I'm here with Grant Killen. Hello Grant, good to see you again.
Thanks mate, happy to be here.
And I'm here with Nicholas Van Hattem. How are you, Nick?
Great to be with you both. I'm going well.
So let's start with you, Nick, because Grant and I are known at this point, so we don't have to go into ourselves. Would love to understand your background and what brings you all the way here to this podcast and this conversation, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, no, good to be with you. I've been a lawyer for about 17 years. I'm now practicing as a barrister. And the best way to explain that is I'm essentially a freelance lawyer. All barristers work for themselves. We're not part of a law firm anymore. But before coming to the bar, before becoming a barrister, had a bit of experience working for commercial law firms and for government. Now I practice mainly in criminal law, but I was previously working a broader range of areas.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but now a lot of your focus is on criminal law defence. And amongst other things, you're dealing with the criminal justice system as it relates to defendants for, allegations of violent, even sexual violence crimes.
That's right. So that's 90% of my practice as a barrister. But in relation to some of the topics we'll be talking about today, I think, my other experience is involved in law organisations. So I'm a past president of the Law Society, and I also set up another organisation called the Piddington Society, which runs a graduate program. So I'm really involved in junior lawyers coming up through the profession and thinking about how they work, what their workplaces look like, and what can be done to make those workplaces a bit better.
Yeah, amazing. So in this conversation, I guess we're talking about, the nexus between, from Grant's experience with policing and supporting victims of crime, and then from your perspective, supporting the alleged perpetrators of crime. So this is going to be a fascinating conversation. Grant, maybe I'll start with you. From a policing perspective, talk me through the process from crime being committed to someone being referred through to someone like Nick. What's the process for an alleged perpetrator of one of the psychosocial kind of crimes that we're talking about on this podcast?
It's a pretty long process, to be honest, from start to finish. And obviously when the police go in to conduct their investigation, and then if there is a complaint and they satisfy a number of different avenues that they need to establish when offence is being committed, regardless of what it is. And then it's just a matter of, due process coming into play and then going through the court process. That's when Nicholas comes into it a little bit later through the court process as a barrister, though. So that's probably the 1,000-foot type view of it. It's obviously a little bit more complex in the middle, depending on the type of hearings and what happens from there. However, it is a long, drawn-out process, yeah.
So, Nick, from your perspective, when do you start coming into someone's referred to you and you choose to take the case on, or how does that work?
Good question. And I think great call from Grant to really focus on how long this all takes. It's a big part of the problem. So something has happened. Straight away, you've got an accused person and a person making an allegation. Defence lawyers would call that person a complainant. It's quite right that ordinarily a barrister gets involved at the very end. There are some occasions where, the friend of the friend calls you on the Saturday afternoon to say, my friend's just been arrested. He needs to speak to a lawyer. Can he speak to you? So that's an example of when a lawyer might get involved pretty early on, when they've got an accused person attending at the police station and they get connected with the lawyer. I've got to give all respect to WAPOL, who make a really big effort to connect people with lawyers, and that's to be commended and part of this fair process that we're talking about. One of the big things that's changed in my career is body-worn camera, and Grant might have some reflections on that as well. But there was a time when a person would make a complaint and you'd go around and take a statement, and things would start with a document low process where we've got a 2-page statement and that starts the process. Now, it's not unusual for routine police attendants to generate hours and hours of body-worn camera footage, which is a good thing. That can be really good evidence. But now the lawyers need to review all that stuff. That means the prosecutors need to review it and the defence lawyers need to review it, and maybe the jury will need to review a lot of it. And it means that things that were already pretty slow moving can also be slowed even more.
Absolutely. Just to make a comment there on your body-worn camera, back in the day when I was first joined the police, we didn't have body-worn cameras. And as Nicholas said, it was just all about doing the notebook, going through, 10 notebooks a month, just statement after statement. And then it was just, and that was a long process. And but now we just sort of transferred that, going into the body-worn cameras and reviewing all that footage. But an absolute sensational, process now with the body-worn cameras. It's very hard to pick up all the different nuances and tone of voice and all that sort of stuff in a notebook statement, was where we can capture all that on the body-worn cameras now, and it just paints definitely a better picture.
Another sort of structural thing I wanted to reflect on, sorry that I'm sort of kicking you out of the facilitator role here, Anthony, but I think a really important perspective to talk about this process and lawyers' engagement with the system and police is to think about it in this way. We've got a complaint that's been made. We've got, let's call them the neutral language of accused and complainant. The accused gets all the rights and all the lawyers. The complainant has no rights and no lawyers. That's a bit of a sensationalist statement to oversimplify it, but the accused person has the right to remain silent, is presumed to be innocent, and if they can't afford a lawyer, if we're talking about a serious charge, the state of Western Australia funds a lawyer. Compare that to the complainant. They don't have the right to remain silent because once they've made that complaint and said this is what happened, it's very difficult for them to subsequently change their mind and say, actually, I don't want to go through with this. And they don't get a lawyer. So there's a prosecutor that will be engaged on behalf of the state and on behalf of the community. And that person will be informed by the complete big effort to engage with the complainant and ensure that that person is heard and their preferences and views are taken into account. But it's the state that's prosecuting the accused person. It's not actually a case between the complainant and the accused person, and the complainant doesn't get their own lawyer. Now, that's starting to change. There are some examples where, for example, the Women's Law Service will intervene in a case to say, for this complainant, because we want to make an application about some confidential material, for example. We want to advocate for the complainant's rights in that process. As the complainant is not well represented in the process necessarily, they can engage with the prosecution, but they don't have a lawyer that singularly represents their interests.
So the system's really slow, and there's clearly a discrepancy between status quo legal representation on both sides. So what's the impact of that on the justice system as it relates to these issues?
I'm happy to go first on this one. Keen for your views as well, Grant. The slowness is a big problem because often, if we're talking about 18 months or longer between allegation and trial, things may have moved on. Relationships may have developed or changed, and that creates one problem. I think another significant problem is that the justice system is a binary system. The question is guilty or not guilty. It's not more nuanced than that. Often there are shades of grey, and the justice system is not designed to take those into account. This is a challenging topic, but the most common area where a shade of grey will arise is boy meets girl, boy and girl like each other, an evening begins well, then something happens. The next day, boy and girl have different views about what happened, and precisely what happened it can be a shade of grey. Now, can I pause there and say there are some cases that are very clear cut, and I'm not talking about those cases when I talk about shades of grey. But there are some cases where nervous, anxious people who've both been consuming alcohol and with different levels of experience and different capacities to communicate their feelings will find themselves in a situation that's not clear cut. The justice system cannot easily reconcile those positions and rather poses the question, is this accused person guilty of a crime where they should go to jail for at least 4 to 6 years? Or is this all made up and the person's not guilty? The justice system doesn't really have the capacity to deliver an outcome between those two quite significantly different positions.
How does that manifest in the policing context, Grant?
Well, it's all about deciphering that grey area, and that's probably one of the hardest things for the police on the ground, right? Like, there's a lot of public perception around these matters being dealt with. The police have to go in there and make a decision on which way that this goes. And many years ago, it was just simply about the police had one view, which was, I just want to cover us, and it was to take out that a particular order, or to lean towards when we're in that grey area, it's about, okay, well, what's going to have less come back on me? I'll just simply take an order out, or I'll take a cross order out on both of them because we can't figure that out. But then, that has its own ongoing, problems down the path.
So what does good look like? Like, if you could wave a magic wand and fix the criminal justice system to make it fairer as it relates to these incredibly complex matters, what would you?
It depends on the case. There are some cases where I've got no proposals. There are some cases that are oath on oath cases where there's only one way to reconcile them, which is present all the evidence to an impartial jury and invite them to make a decision. But in the other cases where it's less clear cut, I do think there is some scope for other forms of corrective justice. And this is a project that I'm putting some work into to consider the international position and consider how this is dealt with in some other jurisdictions where it is more in the form of some form of guided and supported mediation, which is always complainant-led, and I would say in these cases victim-led, because there's an acknowledgement that something happened that was not a good thing. So I do think there's some scope to acknowledge that, to give both sides more rights, give victims the right to remain silent, that they don't need to go through a public court process and be cross-examined. They can obtain apologies and insight and some closure to the extent that that's possible in a more psychologically safe context, because the trial process is very psychologically dangerous. And again, I should pause there and say efforts are being made to make it better. For example, often in cases like this, the complainants can give evidence from a remote room with a support person, and possibly in some cases support animals to help them through a very traumatic process. But the traditional approach is, no, court is designed to be a little bit scary, because the traditional approach to these things is, if we terrify you, that'll help us to work out if you're telling the truth or telling lies. But I think the psychology is saying, well, that doesn't actually assist. Scaring people scares them. It doesn't help us reveal truth.
I completely agree.
And where could you point to, like, around the world, who do you think is doing this the best as it relates to violence, sexual violence, family domestic violence, criminal justice?
The best that I've seen is Scandinavia and the Nordics, and it's both at this early stage of investigation, a difference in approach, but also throughout their justice system, where prisons are not hellholes, where prisons are places that are genuinely intended to rehabilitate offenders. And hand on heart, in Western Australia in 2025, we do not have facilities that are well-resourced to achieve that outcome. We are putting people 3 to a cell in prison and locking them down for more than 24 hours. These are individuals who will be released. So what do we expect will happen when they've been put in animalistic conditions for years at a time? What do you think is going to happen? Are they going to become more functional, or are they going to become less functional? So I'm deeply concerned by this, but part of the challenge is, how can we sell that message to the community to say, hey, we can actually protect the community better by investing more in correctional infrastructure, resources and intervention. It's a hard sell during a cost of living crisis when housing's short, hospitals need reinvestment, and there are a lot of other priorities. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to discuss these sorts of things, because I do see that it's an important investment and it's not one that we're currently making.
How does the Scandinavian example benefit victims, complainants?
I think it's a good question, because sometimes, understandably, some victims just want vengeance, and I can totally understand that perspective. But what we genuinely want as a community is a reduction in crime. And some of the academic studies that I'm showing talk about recidivism rates. And the Nordic experience relates to lower levels of reoffending. And so it might be a complicated conversation to say, I'm sorry, I understand you want vengeance. I understand nothing really short of significant and degrading punishment would satisfy you. But structurally, from a community perspective, we want the overall position to be lower rates of crime. And so I think there's some conversation around that to say, well, I understand where you're coming from, but what we really want to achieve is that the bad experience that you had does not happen again. That should be our focus.
What are your thoughts, Grant? Because now you're dealing a lot with victim survivors who are going through or have been through the system. What are you seeing for their well-being and the process that they have to go through?
Look, I think if you were to ask a Grant 20 years ago, it would have been a totally different opinion around perpetrators need to be in jail. But as Nicholas said, as we start to evolve and mature and we see families going through the process now, I totally agree with the rehabilitation. We need to have more resources in prisons to be able to rehabilitate offenders so they don't come out and do some reoffending, right? And that's whether it's juvenile or whether it's adult, that's what we need to really focus on. I do see a lack of support for victim survivors. And the majority of victim survivors that we talk to, and all they want to just be is safe at the end of the day.
Nick, the majority of your focus as a barrister is on criminal defence, but you also have acted on behalf of, organisations and state governments as it relates to some of these psychosocial risks of workplace violence and workplace fatalities and all of that kind of thing. So what are your insights from that perspective as it relates to this thorny issue of workplace violence or violence in the community or violence at home?
The thing that comes to mind for me is the nature of the work. So every person that touches this work is affected by it. First responders who attended a scene. I'm now thinking about workplace accidents and the psycho-safety issues confronting the people that touch that work. So less about a psychosocial case, but more about a bad thing's happened in a workplace. What are all the effects of that? So I'm thinking about the investigators who don't only come and attend and try to work out what's happened, they have to really get close and confront a very traumatic scene, and they do it often. That then gets documented, and then people who are recovering from a horrible situation are being interrogated, and then the lawyers deal with it, and then the courts deal with it. The courts are affected, the judges are affected by this intense subject matter, so too are their staff, who are often quite junior in age and life experience. Again, I think the legal profession didn't really think about all those effects at the start of my career, or maybe it was emerging as a topic. Whereas now we talk about it a lot, and people are trying to recognise the impact that material has on people day in and day out. We're doing that for the right reasons for the most part. At the same time, there have been cases where lawyers have sued their employers to say, you didn't give me a safe system of work. I've now had these psychological impacts. I was on track for a pretty good career and it's been ruined by your failures. So give me the money. And that's happening. I think we'll see more of those cases. And so while I genuinely believe employers are doing things for the right reasons, there's also an incentive in that litigation context to sharpen their practices and give real thought to how to make workplaces safer, acknowledging that there's always going to be real challenges there.
What's it like when you're a prosecutor acting on behalf of a regulator, let's say, against a company?
And I just had a coffee with a state prosecutor who does fatalities and bad violence. And she sort of jokes a bit about how dehumanised she sometimes feels. And in the same breath, talks about all the additional hours and weekends she works because she cares so much about the community. Right. So there is this resilience in people that practice in this area that I really find invigorating and encouraging, that they care about the mission and they care about the administration of justice, and it takes them through the hard times. And I think this person I'm thinking of is a more senior lawyer and comes from a harder time when there was less support. She's very focused on providing more supports for the people working beneath her. But it can get you down. You need to have processes in place to switch off and come back down to earth. And I find it can certainly affect me, that if I've been doing that work too much, it affects my mood, it affects my sleep, and I need people around me to check in on me and say, "Oi, you need a weekend this weekend, stay home."
I can imagine. Grant, what would you say to that from a police and particularly the DV responders that you're working with all day, every day, the not-for-profits that are out there supporting victims of this?
Yeah, totally agree. I was just going to be a bit self-aware. You normalise this sort of stuff over a period of dealing with 10 to 20 matters a week of various levels of trauma, and you certainly are desensitised, and you got to realise that, hey, it's some of these things are quite horrific, right? So you do need to take stock of it, and you just need to have those support networks around you. I mean, I'm lucky I've got a wonderful family, and I've got a couple of four-legged friends that sort of make life very easy when you feel like you're having a bit of a rough day, and I think we've all been through those sort of periods. But on the front line of, I'll talk about DV, for example, some of the services, they have a caseload of up to 80 participants per person, which becomes phenomenal, and they've got to juggle those things. Okay, well, which one's going to be the most, which one, and to say it bluntly, which one do I think is going to die? Because they're the ones I'm going to focus on. Which is the highest risk, because we're going to try and put those supports around there, because there isn't enough supports for everybody. They've got to start actually deciding, and it's when you see events where some may slip through the cracks and they didn't pick up on a couple of nuances and there is a fatality, that's when it starts to get, extremely difficult.
I think about it from a corporate perspective. I was on the phone with a HR manager just last week after a case that the team got called in quite late, because they weren't an insured client. And the pressure that this HR manager was under, because they had never dealt with anything like this before. They weren't trained for it. They weren't experienced in it, and they didn't feel like they had the tools needed to do the job. And it was just undue pressure, undue stress for elongated periods of time. And some weeks after the event, they were still affected, still traumatized, and their to put it bluntly, their faith and belief in their workplace and the directors and managers of this company had dropped significantly. And my sense of it is that, she was a very high performing individual that any company would love to have, but I don't think she'll be at that company too much longer, because she felt that she was left high and dry through this event, and it's affected her family life, it's affected her sleep, because she wasn't given the tools needed. So it's an excellent point that you kicked off here, Nick, around, when we think about when I think about the psychosocial risk, I'm thinking about the victim and the counterparty to that, obviously. But you're highlighting the psychosocial impacts of anybody along the chain here, from lawyers, police to DV, etc. So the ripple effects of this stuff throughout society just keep, go well beyond what I had been thinking.
Well, most definitely, I totally agree. And when you talk about that particular matter there, we're tuned for this type of work. So where we have the support networks around us, we have a team that are here ready to go, that we bounce things off, that when it's starting to get a lot of pressure, that we can actually turn around and say, hey, I just need you to take the helm for 2 minutes while I just figure a few things out. That particular person, she's just a one person just trying to do her day job as well as deal with this crisis at the time that is just overwhelming. And, I can understand how she would feel that, she's not supported and the value's not there. And, it's one of those things where employees need to start thinking about 2 or 3 runs back, not just the actual people involved in this.
Yeah, it's a huge matter. And no doubt, workers' compensation claims stemming from people that are having to deal with these things, all up and down are rife. So it's hitting
Absolutely.
companies and hitting taxpayers right in the hip pocket. So if we switch focus away from the here and now into the chapter 2, we always sort of focus on like next generation stuff, because some of these problems are so societal that it's going to take time. And so if we think about what should we be doing for those that are, I don't know, 10 or 15, or what should we be doing for those that aren't even born yet, or how parents can support, or how, schools or other parts of the system, so that we don't get, or so we can, turn the tap off of perpetrators hitting the criminal justice system in the first place.
For me personally, it is a generational thing, right? And we see it all the time, especially when we have a look at family violence and things like that. It's like, I see dad doing this, and then you see, the children come through the pipeline of rinse and repeat sort of type attitude. So for me, it's got to start. Yeah, we've got to be in there early. We need to be in there at the daycares, and we need to be, rehabilitating and educating at the same time, so they can break that cycle. We need that solid break within that.
I totally agree with that. I do think it is about children and ensuring that they're thriving and ensuring that they're safe, because so much of youth crime is because something has happened to that kid. They're not in a safe environment. They're not getting good role models. They're not getting good structure. The answer is not lock them up. That doesn't really achieve much. The answer is have some safe structures, community-led ideally. And there's some really good examples of that up north where, again, let's look at the data. What interventions are reducing reoffending or crime rates? Safe places for kids to go, have a meal and play basketball are having an impact. And if you're going to spend money on this problem, well, that's a pretty cheap and a pretty effective way to spend some money to have the outcome that the kids are safe, they've got somewhere to go. And I think that's a promising thing that we're seeing now, and we can see more of in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of programs over here in Queensland that have been run, and I'll highlight a couple. We've got YFS down in the Logan area that run their After Respect program, the youth mentoringship, and that's exactly what it's about, ensuring that there's a safe place for them to go, that they do have food, and they've got that support and that solid role model. They're seeing some fantastic results for things like that. So
I read this thing recently which said that girls learn through communication and boys learn through emulation. I'm not sure how generalized it is or how accurate it is across the board, but when we think about how do we nip it in the bud so that the next generation of boys don't become offenders, if they're learning through emulation, then positive role models, positive masculine role models has to be a big part of this, I think.
I think it's really interesting to talk about gendered role model. And Anthony, I'm reflecting on some other conversations we've had about education. And I reflect on my private school education and with all boys. And I don't have the answers for this, but I am interested in this idea of we've got to treat genders differently. I think one of my reflections is that the all boy school system is a bit weird. That's my considered opinion. More opportunities for boys and girls to be together, it's probably a good thing. And boys being by themselves and treating women as this other that is different, I think is part of the problem. You had raised, Anthony, talking a bit about the not-for-profit sector, which is an important part, and Grant was talking about some of his experiences there. One of the most interesting programs I've seen this year is a program funded by one community legal centre to fund perpetrator side services. So a lot of the programs, now, again, I'll pause and say everyone is legitimately asking for more funding. I've talked about more funding for prisons and corrections. Grant's talked about more funding for victim support. And sadly, I'd say you need to do both. And we need more money across the board. But then a third category is this offender side legal support. So there is a program running in WA now that says we'll actually give some legal assistance to the alleged perpetrator of the family violence in the violent restraining order proceedings. And counterintuitively, that's really helping victims, because sometimes the court is not able to fully give the advice they need to hear. I'm talking about the alleged perpetrators, and give them the steps they need to undertake and give them a realistic view of what the future is going to be in terms of those proceedings, and funding a lawyer for the alleged perpetrator who can sit down and say, this is the way it's going to be. This is what the law says. Let's negotiate appropriate conditions. We can do that. What you can't do is resist this order, because at a final order hearing, you're going to lose. So let's be realistic. Now, that it's a counterintuitive approach, and it's not as politically attractive as some of these other programs that are more obviously victim-oriented. But what that program is demonstrating is actually by funding that, you're going to help victims. There's going to be fewer hearings. It's going to be more sensible outcomes, and it is going to create better outcomes for victims.
I agree. And there's got to be something that we can do to reduce this backlog through the courts, and the courts being the only path that we can travel down to deal with these matters, because we're just going to see more and more of it, right? We're going to see more and more backlogs of courts. And
Anthony, how disappointing for you. We've got the police officer and the defence lawyer, and we're just in furious agreement about everything.
As I was saying before, if you called me 20 years ago, I reckon we'd be putting the mouth guards in and getting stuck into it. It's funny how we mature, right? There was a police officer I worked for in the Brisbane city. Hopefully he comes on the show. He totally changed my outlook about dealing with offenders, and it's all about, respect and empathy and understanding where their backgrounds are and what led them to this situation. Totally changed my outlook about rehabilitation and what we actually need to be doing.
I want to say the same. When I was more of a firebrand junior lawyer, you have this anti-establishment, anti-government, anti-police attitude.
Yeah.
And the more I've done, the more I've learned. There's some extraordinary police officers, and I have no hesitation in saying that. I did learn something, I think, that is a bit instructive. And I've spent some time when I was in state government working with some police, including some disciplinary proceedings. So what I want to start by saying, there's some exceptional police officers, and I take nothing away from that. Obviously, in the same way that there's some lawyers who don't work to the standards I expect, there are, from time to time, obviously, some individuals in every institution you can think of that don't meet the standards. But one of the rules of thumb that I was sort of shown was the place to have the attention there is mid-career. So that rookies straight out of the academy are pretty impressive. They've been well-trained, well-drilled, they're committed to a future career, and they've got really high levels of integrity. Similarly, senior officers in higher ranks, the same. They've made a career out of it. They've made a life out of it. It's really important to them. And your expectation is integrity will be present and obvious. Where some of my colleagues were saying you've got to be particularly careful is that mid-career, and it hasn't gone quite as well as they thought it would. It looked for a few promotions, and that's where there can be some issues. So I think I've matured as well. I think I'm very quick to acknowledge some extraordinary police officers, extraordinary generosity, courage and integrity. It's very rare to come across anyone that doesn't manifest those values, but there are some warning signs sometimes and that's where it's that disgruntled place, which I think in a way comes back to my overall thesis that when a bad thing happens, there's often some reasons for it.
Yeah.
It's not that something's happened in a moment. Something's been brewing for a while. It doesn't matter who you're talking about. So if we can take that into account, that's another way we can reduce bad things from happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a massive, massive obligation that you and your colleagues take on across the criminal justice system. Nick, thanks for joining us today, and I really commend your efforts to lean into the topic of trying to enhance and improve and make the criminal justice system more empathetic, and particularly with a focus on how alleged perpetrators and those that have been through the criminal justice system can be properly rehabilitated. I think that's powerful, powerful work, and good on you for leading the charge.
Great to talk to you. Thanks both, Grant, Anthony. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming along.
Thanks, guys.